Recording. Preparing to live stream. Going live. Looks like we may be live. Cerise.
Seeing it yet on your feed. Oh, okay.
Okay. Welcome everybody to another edition of our Facebook Live panel chats. This grid is looking so beautiful and colorful to me. Thanks everybody for joining, and welcome to anybody who may be joining us here for the live or later, either here on any of our Facebook pages or on my YouTube channel. I will be sure to put that link in the comments. And we are here today to talk about some of our favorite books that have guided us on our spiritual path. And any of the books that are mentioned today, I will include in the notes, so you don't have to be, madly scribbling away. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest host tonight, Linda Hoyo. Go for it, Linda.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Linda Polio, and I live in Sedona, Arizona. I met Kay in Sedona. So I've been involved with spiritual books for probably most of my life because I've been on a lifelong journey. I'm currently a consciousness doula, and I'm also an author of a spiritual book. So I was first influenced, I was talking to Kay yesterday, and I think one of the first books that I read was Seed of the Soul by Gary Zukav. So I think what we want to talk about is just what books, when you were beginning your journey, kind of influenced you and sparked you. I think for me, books were important, particularly in the beginning, because I didn't know anyone having the experiences that I was having, and they validated my experiences, and they made me believe that I wasn't completely crazy, and they guided me on the journey. So I just love to hear other books that people have read along their path and why it was such a, such an influence to you.
Great. Would we like to do a little brief introduction of everybody who's here?
Oh, sure.
That? Yeah, great. Cerise, why don't you start us off?
Sure. Hi, I'm Cerise Thich. I am the co-owner of Aura Wellness in Tenafly, New Jersey, which is going to be opening in September, and it's going to offer a ton of, spiritual classes, meditation classes, women's circles, acupuncture, physical therapy, etc. And I've been on my spiritual journey for probably the last 20 years. So it's a continuous journey and ever evolving. And I am so looking forward to this discussion about books because they are my closest friends.
Joan?
Hi, I'm Joan Advent, and I am in Virginia, the Richmond area. And I am a leadership mentor and catalyst for joy. I have been on a conscious spiritual journey probably for the last 30 years. And to be honest with you, full disclosure, I'm not a huge reader. I mean, I have read a number of seminal books in the last 30 years, but I'm not a voracious reader, which it sounds like many of you are. My most preferred way to receive is through listening to things, and which I have listened to some books, and also just diving in and trying it out. So thank you for having me.
Thanks. Hi, Megan.
Hi. Oh, there I am. Hello. Hi, everyone. My name's Megan. I'm logging in here from Batavia, Illinois. We've had back-to-back tornadoes for the last 2 days. It's been really high energy here in this little pocket of the Midwest. So there's a beautiful calm actually here tonight, which is I think right in line with our theme. I think reading and calm kind of go hand in hand. For me, it's a very calming medium. I'm an independent yoga instructor, probably primarily, but I lead meditation and breath work and mantra, most recently mantra workshops. I've released my first publication this year, which is really exciting to not only be discussing books, which of course is a passion, but to be doing it at a point when I've just become an author. So this is fun to be on all ends of the spectrum here. And I'm really excited to talk tonight because I think I have a real zinger, like a book that really will surprise everybody that I'm even going to discuss. So I'm just really excited. And I can't wait to hear what other books everybody else brings up. Because I'm in and out. Sometimes I'm a consistent reader. Usually it's a little bit more of like a attention deficit kind of reader. Like I got 3 books going at once. Or I go through phases where I read, every book and a single author put out in a matter of moments, right? So I'm all over the place. But thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, I'm more like Joan as well. I also take more information in audio. So books have been a struggle when I read them. So it takes me a while to read them because my brain does not really read one word after another. It more looks at a page and wants to just suck the information in. So I have to slow down my energy just to read. So I completely understand that. So I've also leaned towards audiobooks because my brain just works better that way. But like I said, when I was waking up, when I was young, I didn't have anyone to talk to about what was happening to me. So I wandered into a bookstore in New York City called Quest, and it was an esoteric bookstore. And I felt like I was home. And it wasn't because I was such a big reader, but it was because the ideas in those books really resonated with the experiences that I was having. And Seed of the Soul was one of the first ones. Bringers of the Dawn was another one, which is basically a channeled book. And no one was talking about channeling back then. So I'd love to hear, Megan, what your zinger is. I think it'd be great to start with what the zinger is that you have and see where we go from there.
Okay, alrighty. So the reason is like I could name several spiritual books that have just wowed me or changed my life, or even in the simplest just caused like a pivot, right? A pivotal moment for me. Oh, I never thought of life this way, right? Something really powerfully impactful. But I am reading. I don't know if you say reading. I'm listening to an audiobook right now because I do a lot of road trips, and that's the book that I'm bringing up. Because I had a little bit of, I'm going through like a child phase lately, meaning I don't mean to, but I'm facing like the wounded child. I'm facing the magical child. I have a lot of these childhood memories that have just been really coming through for me. And one of them came through in the form of a book in the last couple of weeks, and I've started listening to The Secret Garden. And I chose, are we all familiar with The Secret Garden? It's like the book was written in 1911, right? Frances Hodgson Burnett is the author. But this is a book that I read when I was coming of age, when I was a tween, right? Like it was one of the first books I had an intimate experience with by choice, right? It wasn't something that I had to read for school. It wasn't something my parents directed me to read. It was a book that I chose to read during this sort of pre-pubescent, tender time in my life. And without knowing it, it was a deeply spiritual experience for me to read this book. And at the time, I didn't realize that I wouldn't have associated it with matters of the spirit in any way. But as I was called, for whatever reason, in the last couple of weeks to engage in this book again, it is hitting me in a way that I didn't expect. So the reason I thought of it is because I'm discovering that not only do I love animals, I'm discovering I'm more of an animal empath. And this has just been this strange development in my life. I've always loved animals, or I became a vegetarian at a really young age, or I still love animals. All I want to do is go in nature. And then I started having animal visions and understanding for the first time in my life what visions were, right? For me, anyhow, what my experience of a vision is. So I had animal visions for several years, and then those have completely fallen off, and now I just have this animal empathy. I for lack of a better term, I've discovered this animal empath in me. And so all of it's coming together this summer. I'm like listening to The Secret Garden, and the magic, right? The spiritual component that keeps flushing over me again and again is the reason I loved that book so much at the time I was reading it was because it validated to me what I did not think anyone else in the world was doing at that time, which was talking to animals. Going in the backyard and having full-on conversations with animals back and forth as beings, and those animals reciprocating in the conversation, and not understanding enough at that age that I didn't think I was crazy. I just knew I wasn't really going to tell anybody that I was talking to animals and they were responding and we were having conversations. And The Secret Garden, like, validated that, because that's what these young characters, these young central characters are doing. Not only are they leaning into nature, but very specifically at times and in a very purposely woven way, they are leaning into these relationships that they built with animals. And it's been a really powerful experience to revisit my youth at a time when I'm already been, working with some wounded child stuff. And like I said, and also joyful child, work that I've been doing. And then this book and the animal empathy and the reminder that a spiritual book isn't always a spiritual book, on purpose. Like it was not marketed this way. I don't think. Anyway, so that's the book that's really been fun to revisit and to re-communicate with for me.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because I think a lot of books that we consider spiritual or that have spiritual effect on us, they change when you read them at different times in your life. And I know with my book, people will read it and then a year later they'll read it and they read different things. And I think that's very normal for books that are spiritual, because they evolve with you. Consciousness of the book evolves with your own consciousness. Has anyone else had that experience of reading a book at one point in their life that had influence on them, but then years later reading it again and it had a different influence on them, or they saw things in it that they didn't see before that? Yeah. Yeah, no, I found that to be true with a couple of the books, particularly the older books from the turn of the century or the.
Yes.
Well, like I said, I'm just about to read Siddhartha again, and I read Siddhartha, which was published in 1911. I read that in high school, and I don't remember it having any specific influence on me. But someone just recently reminded me that it was a real spiritual book, and Herman Hesse is actually a spiritual writer, and I never thought of him that way because I first read his work, I wasn't awake yet. So it's interesting to see how that will evolve. And you know, also being on the path a long time, Joan, you've been on the spiritual path a long time. So your journey has included several books during several incarnations of your journey. Can you
Yes.
talk about one that really influenced you at a particular point in time?
Well, before I do that, I would love to know the name of your book, Linda. Just
Oh, my book is my book is Trusting the Currents.
Trusting the Currents. Okay, beautiful. It just felt like it needed to be named.
Yeah, I never expected to write a book. Yeah, I never expected to write a book. I was not, because I'm not a big reader. So the fact that I was going to write a book, but this was channeled to me by an old Black woman, and all the characters are Black.
Wow.
And it took 10 years to write it, but it's done very well. It's won 13 literary awards. And it's been #1 in inspirational fiction on Amazon. So the thing about the book, I mean, this book happened to do the same thing, but I like reading books that when I read them years later, they influence me in a different way because I'm in a different place.
Yes.
But you know, I think, you know, all of us seem to have been on this conscious path for quite a while. So I think, you know, as we read books, they hit us at different, and they also come to us. Books resonate with us, so they will appear to us when we need them.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious as to what appeared to people as they needed them on their path.
Yes. Well, if I can continue, as Megan was talking, I was thinking for me that there have been a couple of threads related to spiritual reading that I've done. One has been like spiritual memoir, because I really love people's stories. I was trained as a therapist, so I really love diving into people's stories. So I think about books like The Camino that Shirley MacLaine wrote, or Lessons in Becoming Myself that was Ellen Burstyn's autobiography, and books like that aren't necessarily the traditional spiritual books, but that really fed me in a way. And certainly Autobiography of a Yogi, Paramahansa Yogananda's book was very impactful, which I did listen to rather than read. But the book I feel called to just throw out, because it was my first, we'll say, adult awakening book, was Matthew Fox's book, Original Blessing, which was written back in the 80s. And I, in the mid to late 80s, I was in a car accident. And so I was like bedridden for a while. And it was a reset. And it was when I read the book. Like, I was slow enough that I could be present with it. As someone who was born and raised Catholic, it was groundbreaking for me at a time when I was going through my awakening process in a more conscious way. And it like seeded some things that would develop later in my life. And the other element of books that I wanted to name is, having grown up in a Christian tradition, and specifically Catholic, I've been drawn a lot to books that relate to Christian figures. So whether it's Mary Magdalene or the Anna books, Grandmother of Jesus, or things like that, it's been really meaningful for me to dive into those stories. And I will say, I once read a book named, I think it was called Biff. It was The Best Friend of Jesus. It was this satirical book back in the 90s. Anyway, I'll stop with that. Thank you.
It's true that a lot of books that aren't considered spiritual actually become spiritual teachers for us along the way too. It depends on where we are and what's going on in our lives. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate that. Cece, how about you? What books have influenced you?
So it's interesting that Joan mentioned one of them, but I think the first one that I can recall was reading in high school The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley. Telling the story of King Arthur from the feminine perspective. So for me, that was a shift. At the time I was, starting my journey as being a feminist, and just, hearing the story, reading the story from that different perspective really had an impact on my life, and understanding that, there are so many different sides to a story, and there's and they're not always objective. And so that helped to open me up to seeing different perspectives. That same year I also was introduced to The Alchemist, which I have read again since my high school days, and definitely got different meanings from it. Rereading it, it's definitely one that can be read more than once. And it has had such an impact on my life, even now as I've been, working towards, this wellness center. It's just surrendering to the universe and going with the flow, which is, very similar to the story, where Santiago is on this quest, right? And all these things happen to him, but he's, the universe, has got his back in so many different ways. And the different characters he's introduced to are like the different people that we've contracted to be in our life for different purposes and to help us along the way. And so, I do think of The Alchemist often as I'm on my journey and on my spiritual journey, and the decisions that I'm making. And, I notice that when I surrender, I can listen to my intuition better, and, the universe, shows me the right path. When I don't listen to the universe, when I don't surrender, I also have found that I make some wrong decisions along the way. And, and I can see that, as I reflect on what's going on, and the decisions that are getting made. But Joan mentioned Anna, Grandmother of Jesus, by Claire Hartsong, which is also a channeled book that also had, very similar to The Mist of Avalon for me, telling the story from, Jesus's grandmother's perspective, and also being raised, in a very Christian way, just seeing things and understanding things from that different perspective. And and Joan had also mentioned the everything about Mary Magdalene, and there's the books Mary Magdalene Revealed by Megan Watterson has also, in conjunction with Anna, Grandmother of Jesus, has had such an impact, because it takes you to another time. So Anna, Grandmother of Jesus, being channeled, tells the story, and shows a lot of what the women were doing at the time. And then what Megan Watterson did with Mary Magdalene Revealed is so much research too, and backing up a lot of the information, with a lot of, texts, academic texts and things, and all the research that went into that book, and all of the stories that are in there, again, taking a different perspective on, how I was raised, and, and seeing that there are different stories and different perspectives, to challenge. So you have a little bit of that cognitive dissonance, happening from, what you understood as a child. And then, as you're going into adulthood, challenging some of the things that you were taught and learned, from different mentors, and leaders and family members, et cetera. So, those are some of the books that really have helped me on my spiritual journey.
Yeah, it's really interesting. All the books that everyone mentioned, and I think probably most spiritual books, I think the number one thing that they do is they shift our perspective. They help us see aspects of ourselves and our life and the world that we didn't see without them. and they open up these gateways into a vision for the future that we didn't see before. So yeah, that's a really, it's been interesting to listen to all of you because that seems to be the thread through all these books. Kay, what books really shifted your perspective because you've been on this journey a long time too?
Yeah. Well, I have to say that Megan has kind of shifted the whole scenario for me. I need to come like immediately when she started talking about the secret garden, I was like, oh my God, yes, I was reading spiritual books back when I was really first starting to read. And the book that immediately came to mind was the Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle series. Are you guys familiar with Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle? Well, she was a nanny and she was kind of like a magical child worker. And she would be called upon by parents in despair over the behaviors of their children. There was always some kind of crazy problem child in the picture. And she really, I was so drawn to these books. And now that I've been given this perspective that that Megan has brought forth, I think like her secret weapon was love. She could love these children no matter what they were doing. And it was through that love that she was able to craft the cure, which was always came from a loving perspective. And so, wow, I'm going to have to add that to my list. And then also I'm thinking about, I like Linda consider my spiritual path with books to have begun around that era of when Gary Zukav came out with The Seed of the Soul. But looking back, I was always really drawn to books on philosophy and characters like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and some of the Tom Robbins books that I read in college. And then moving on from there, books about and about Jack Kerouac and figures who were kind of questioning. And that is what I want to say mostly about spiritual books for me have always, they're not like how-to books. If you find a book that's got like the 8 stages up to or the 8 steps to spiritual enlightenment, like hard pass. Because what these spiritual books do for me, and I've read hundreds and hundreds of spiritual books, is that they cause me to question my current system of beliefs. And not all of them work in that way. I mean, some of them have been like a companion, like Cerise said, that they were some of her best friends, because to be honest, this spiritual path can be full of turmoil. And so some of the books that have been very meaningful to me have been those that are like a balm to my soul, just like have the capacity to calm me through wisdom rather than knowledge. And I also want to say, as the writer of spiritual books, these books are really just tools. They're not meant to be like the word. They're, no matter how learned or accomplished an author is, it's still just one perspective. And so, but sometimes that one perspective is enough to just like turn on a light bulb for you. So over the years, like I feel like I've read everything, so it'd be kind of crazy for me to try to choose which books have been the most influential, because like you, Linda, I would walk into the Quest bookstore in Wheaton, Illinois, where I raised my children. And I would say, okay, book, choose me, jump off the shelf into my hands. What do I need to read next? And without fail, that would always be exactly what would happen. I would get just the next gem that would take me further on this path. But right now, I want to say that some of the most influential books that I have been reading right now are the Anastasia series, for sure. That really, really changed my life. And then also these books The Life and Teaching of the Masters of the Far East. It's a set of 8 books, and those were really, really powerful for me. Right now, this summer, I'm having like the Summer of Jesus, and I'm reading the Course in Miracles, which I've known about for decades, but I've never been drawn to read it. So I'm really enjoying / struggling through that. And what was the other one I wanted to mention? Yeah, can't think of it right now. So yeah, that's kind of my story with the books.
Wow, that's great. I love the idea of books jumping out at us, because I think that really does happen. I was in a bookstore in a Barnes and Noble in Flagstaff one time, and this is several years ago. This is before I moved to Sedona, but I was visiting, and I was up there, and I'm walking through the spiritual book session, and I hear a thud, and I turn around, and there's a book laying on the floor. And I pick it up, and it was The Presence Process by, I think his name was Michael Brown. It was published by Namaste Publishing, who actually published The Power of Now. They were the first publisher of The Power of Now. They were a small spiritual imprint. And it was a thick book, and I'm not a huge reader, so a thick book is scary to me. And I looked at it, I went, oh no, I don't know. And I decided to buy it, and I did read it, and it took a while. And what I found interesting, it was all about presence. It was all about finding a way to be present. But the way he did it is in his languaging. And I'm very much into languaging in books, because I think the way that books are languaged, words hold frequencies. So when a book is languaged a certain way, you're actually being able to bring in the transmission that is being brought in by the author. So the way he wrote he kind of was redundant in the way he wrote, but he said later on in the book that that's the way he wrote it, because things need to be heard 3 times before they stick in your brain. So it was very interesting. It was a very interesting book to read, because it wasn't just a normal book, but it actually was not only a book about presence, but it was a way about how to get present through the way that he was languaging it.
So if I can jump in, I'm feeling called to share. There are a couple of books for me that have been a real dovetail of like the sensual human experience coupled with our spiritual journey, 2 of which were memoir, which I do have my show and tell, which I adore this book called The Bread of Angels by Stephanie Saldana. And it is set in Syria. It's set in Damascus in the 90s, I think. And it's about a young woman's quest who was getting her PhD in divinity, but it explores the Muslim faith and Jesus in the Quran from the lens of someone who was raised Catholic. And it's a love story, but her description, she writes very poetically. So Linda, when you're talking about the way the languaging of the book is done, how it impacts you, the pictures she painted of like the call to prayer at the 5 o'clock hour were so profoundly moving. And these retreat spaces in these caves in the hills of Syria that were thousands of years old, it just transmits more than just the spiritual truths or wisdom. It kind of takes you to that place. So I wanted to give a shout out. This is like one of my favorite memoirs of all time. And I'm also thinking about Sarah Beek's book, who was a contemporary of Megan Waterston, Red Hot and Holy, which is, again, that integration of our sensuality, sexuality with our spiritual nature, which it's like as a woman exploring the divine feminine, it feels like it's important to have those represented. And then the last one, which is quite a short book, is called The Mistress of Longing, which is written actually by a friend of mine, Wendy Havler Cherry, and it too is very poetic, but it is rooted in the spiritual necessity of longing and desire, and the sacredness of that, and the invitation back to that again and again. And it just felt like I had to name those very poetic, kind of feminine, more feminine essence kind of books here. So thank you.
Great. Well, I think, for a lot of us, a lot of people on this journey are women, and we perceive and we take in a lot of the information that are in these books differently than men take them in. And the spiritual journey, because human technology is very feminine, wisdom, intuition, compassion, empathy, forgiveness, gratitude are very feminine experiences and very feminine energies. And many spiritual books are wrapped around those concepts. So the idea of, women being women, I think it's really important when it comes to spiritual books, is the way that women read these books versus the way men read the books. And it's not better, it's just very, very different.
Right. And the form that our spiritual hunger takes looks different than it does for most male initiates or practitioners.
Yeah, it's interesting. Oh, that's great. It's really interesting to speak to people about spiritual books, because there's a lot of book clubs and people talk about books, but spiritual books really have a very different influence on us. And most of them stay with us in some way, shape, or form longer than when you read a regular novel or a regular book. You read it, you get the information, and it's more about information and knowledge, and then you move on with it. Spiritual books, they kind of linger in you, and there's a resonance that takes you further. The book that I kind of read a lot of when I was taking care of my mother for 9 years. So that was a really difficult time. And I went into a very deep, dark night of the soul, and I found spiritual books kind of lift you up a little bit when you're in that dark space. So I was reading a lot of Pema Chodron's books at that time, Falling Apart, because I needed I needed a book that understood where I was at that point in my life, and kind of held an anchor and a foundation for me to stand on, so I wouldn't fall too deep, because I knew reading something happy wouldn't have helped, because I was in a very dark place. So I was just curious, has anybody else been in places in their lives that were really, really difficult, and they found a book or an author that kind of held that space for them and helped them through a really difficult time?
I can speak to this. I'm sure everyone on this panel is like, oh yeah, I could think of 5 or 10. When I was going through and post-divorce, women who run with the wolves came into my life, and this wasn't there was no rage. There was no rage happening through my divorce process. It was more, again, it was pivotal, right? It was a pivotal moment, and I needed to hear. So women who run with the wolves, I think what I needed at that time was this filtration process that the author Clarrissa Pinkola Estes filters out the mistruths, right? The misguided truths of these folk stories, meaning that these stories originally were very pro life affirming for women, these folk stories, but through time they were manipulated and they were changed to disempower women. And so reading Women Who Run with the Wolves, whose very purpose was to filter purify, clarify, and bring back to its true form these folk stories that were that included empowering central characters that were women. I read this book at a time when I needed to be purified and clarified, and I needed the filtration of my own feminine central character, right? Like I had lost the central character altogether. And so not only was it like, ooh, it had this sort of, you know, little feminist undercharge that I needed during a divorce, but it wasn't about rage. It was about that purification back to truth, back to reality, back to who you really are, back to who these central strong female characters were in these stories that were designed, again, I come back, designed to aid the coming of age for women, these pivotal moments, these crossroads in our life where we, you know, move from a child to a preteen, and a preteen to our fertile years, et cetera, et cetera. It moves through all the phases of life for a woman too. So anyways, it came to me at a time that couldn't have been more direct. And then just really quick, another one that did that was when I was in college and I needed to find a passion to write about. And I read Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, and that fired me up in college, right? It was so like, you know, revolutionary, and a woman saying some really hard things and being very scientific and like delivering some hard truths. And that was really fun because in college you're like, yeah, I got a voice and I'm a little bit of an anarchist, and you know, like you're going, and she just like fired me up when I needed to be fired up, you know. Silent Spring.
That's great. Anyone else have books that really kind of fired them up at a point in time, or gave them a foundation that they needed to kind of cling to?
Yeah,
Okay.
I want to speak to two aspects of what you've been talking about, Linda. And the first one is the frequency of books, and these are interrelated for me. And I don't think that any book has given me a clearer understanding of the frequency in writing as the Anastasia books. And I will say that lately, the books that I have been reading are really focused on describing for me what the original template was for humanity, so that I can begin to move my barometer in that direction. And I was writing the book that I'm currently still writing last summer when I started reading the Anastasia books. And I think there are 8 in that series as well. And I read them back to back to back to back to back. I was never without that book. And one of the things that that book so brilliantly communicated was our creative power. And my creativity in these books was on fire. And there was no doubt in my mind that it was the frequency of the books working through me, and the frequency that was working through the central character, Anastasia, was the gift of the creator for humanity to create. And so I felt like this channel of there's the gift of being creative, and it was so potent. And I had some crazy experiences where this character, I'm calling her a character, but she's really a real person, came into my life so strongly and brought me messages that could not be denied because of the words that were used or the actions that occurred. And it was so powerful for me to have that intense of an experience with a character in a book. I mean, it sounds crazy, but yeah, so definitely the Anastasia books for me hit that.
Beautiful. That's great. Yeah, I know that. I understand the idea of a character kind of becoming more to you than what you would expect them to be. I mean, the narrator of my book, Trusting the Currents, is Addie Mae Aubrey. And when she came to me, like I said, I had no intention of writing a book, and I believe that she's been the most influential person in my life. She moved me in a direction that I never would have. And she brought me into a culture that I didn't have any contact, any real understanding or interest in. And yet she brought me in and told me that even though we were different races and we were from different times and different places, we were really the same. I mean, she really taught me. She was one of my biggest teachers. And I think that's, even though it was a book that I wrote, for the first draft, I didn't even put my name on it because I felt like it was her. So I would say, by Addie Mae Aubrey, as told to Linda Pollio. It wasn't after I took 8 years to edit it that I put my name on it. But I think, I think characters in books really become beacons for us in a lot of ways, and they become family and friends. And I don't know, does anyone else have anyone in a book, even a book you've written or a book that you've read, that there's one particular character that you so resonated with that you felt like they were real in some ways? No, that's okay. But yeah, no, I love characters in books. So even The Alchemist, the characters, because characters in books hold us. They become us and we become them, and we apply our own thoughts and beliefs and everything to them, and they impart their beliefs and their thoughts to us. So by the time we finish with a book, very often we have such a relationship with at least one of the characters, particularly if it's a narrator or it's a memoir and you're reading about someone else, but you really feel that she's writing or he's writing about you too.
I felt this way reading Ishmael. It wasn't a human central character. The old gorilla got me, but yeah, Ishmael. I mean, I couldn't shake Ishmael for years. Like, yeah.
And I was going to say on Anna from Anna, grandmother of Jesus, impacted me in that way, like the arc of her story and getting to see life in those times and the development of that movement through her eyes was very powerful for me, and the connection with her.
Beautiful.
It kind of makes me think about this idea that if you have thought a thought, that occurrence has already happened somewhere in the universe. And also that these characters that we're calling them, whether they be fictitious or appearing in real life, the characters that we dream up are real as well. And the story of the family of humanity is told through these characters, and there are aspects of us in everyone. And so I think that's why we relate to these characters so strongly, is because their truth is universal. And so it's true for us. And that doesn't mean that, everything that you read is true for you, but the ones that truly resonate, the ones that you learn lessons from, the ones that inspire you or lead you in a new direction, spark some creativity, are real. They are real to you, just occurring in a different plane.
No, it's true. They become part of your own history, your own sort of spiritual and intellectual history. And it's something you share. Like I mean, I'm very curious too, do any of you have particular books that you love to share, that you've had experiences with, that you share more than other books? Because we all have, which books do you share, Kay?
I will say, like, one of the books that I feel was most pivotal in changing my life, my attitude toward life, was The Hidden Messages in Water by, what's his name? Masaru
Emoto.
Emoto. Yeah, Mr. Emoto. So when people ask me for book recommendations, that might be one that is at the top of my list. And the reason for that is because that book changed the way I spoke to myself, not just verbally, but the way I thought about myself, because of the experiments that he did with the water, realizing that the canister of the body is a canister of water, and what my negative self-talk might be actually doing to me. That was like a pivotal shift for me. And it's like a book that anybody can read. It's not overtly spiritual. It's based in science, but could be so incredibly potent. So I tend to recommend that one. And then years ago, my ex-husband's aunt, Carlotta, recommended a book to me it was called Always We Begin Again. And it was a little teeny tiny book by a Benedictine priest. And it talked about the beauty of daily ritual, daily devotion, having a schedule, creating the life that you want to lead, that leads to the fruit of your greatest happiness. So that's one that I used to recommend all the time. Also a really tiny book. And I love a tiny book.
Anyone else have books that they love to recommend?
I've recently, someone was asking me that they wanted to get more into spirituality. Could I recommend some books for them? So I recommended that they start with like the Four Agreements. I
Beautiful
told
book.
to look at the Celestine Prophecy, The Secret, just to get, I mean, this is like very, starting out on their spiritual journey. So thought that they could start there. But I've given so many copies of The Alchemist out to friends. The Anastasia books I've loaned to, I loan those. Those are hard to come by. They're hard to buy too. I have mine here, but if I loan it to someone, I ask for it back because it's precious to me. Like I said, a friend. So those are just a few that those are my go-tos, if you will.
If I may, rapid fire a few. This is a cool question for me because I have known a couple people that are incarcerated, but right now someone very close to me in my immediate family is incarcerated, and I send him books, and I've caught myself like I need to send books that are going to change his life, right? Like so I tend to send like the powerhouse list and some that we've already mentioned, but these are the books I've sent him in the 5 years he's been in there: The Prophet, The Power of Now, Ishmael, Hidden Messages in Water, Ho'oponopono, The Alchemist, Pieces Every Step. These are the books that I have sent to someone in prison, and I'm like, I need to calm down a little bit too, because you don't want to force it, but it just made me think like, wow, that's kind of funny that these are the books. But Pieces Every Step, this is Thich Nhat Hanh. This is it's a tiny book, and oh man, does it speak everyone's language. I mean, if it can turn laundry and washing the dishes into spiritual practices, right? This is such a great book, Pieces Every Step. I give that away a lot.
There's one book that I love to tell people about, but now I cannot remember the name of it, but I'll give it to Kay so that she can put it in the notes. And it's something about how the earth heals. And it was written in the 90s, I think, by a psychologist who had gone to the Amazon and gotten super, super sick. And he came back and they gave him like 2 weeks to live. He had picked up some crazy bug there. And he began going out on the earth and just laying on the earth and asking the earth to heal him. And it took him a year, but slowly he started healing from just going on the earth and communicating with the earth. And he then started having mystical experiences and began to be able to heal people. So he went back to his practice and began healing people. And the book is his story, but it's also exercises of how to go to the earth and ask the earth for healing. And it's very simple. It's not a big book. It's the one I have is a hardcover. And it's a beautiful book to read and just take it and go lay on the land and ask the land for physical help and emotional help, because the earth has so much for us, but we don't think about going and asking it for help. So I'll give Kay the name of the book. I'll track it down here, and it's a beautiful book, and it's very simple, and it'll teach you how to connect to the earth in ways that you probably haven't thought of before. Well, it's 8:56, right? It's 5:56 here in Sedona. Kay, this was great. I'm so honored to have moderated this, because as a spiritual writer, but also someone who's been on a spiritual path for a long time and has really needed books from time to time as little landmarks and goalposts for me as I go through, because every time you think you know something, all of a sudden you realize you know nothing. And then there's a book that helps you realize, okay, now I get to learn this, so I know something again, until you know nothing again. So books for me have been very much like that. And I love people that use books also for their own spiritual growth as well. So I want to thank all of you for being part of this, and Kay for inviting me to be part of this. And I'll turn it back over to Kay.
Anybody have any last thoughts? Joan?
Yes. So when Linda was talking about the power of the earth, I was remembering there's a book of John O'Donoghue's that's called Beauty, the Hidden Embrace, or Invisible Embrace. And it talks about his relationship in part with Ireland, his homeland, and talks about how landscape will miss us. Like the landscape of where we live will miss us when we're not there. And so that just came in, and I wanted to share both that and the book, because it's such an incredible book. It just is such a transmission of beauty and helps open up our eyes and all of our senses to the beauty in the world. And I did want to ask you, Kay, because I am a fan of your book and have given that to others, to just share your book, what your book is.
Well, I have written 2 books. One is called Divorce: A Love Story, and it was really a memoir of my experience through conscious uncoupling. It really is not for just people going through that experience, but anybody who wants to allow their lives to teach them what they came to learn. And then my second book was called Dear Human, and I call it it's kind of like a guidebook that sits on the seat next to you as you're on a road trip, and just to give you little bits of inspiration and guidance along the way. And I'm currently at work, and soon we'll be finishing my 3rd book, which I have a new working title for. It's called Land, Sister, Sky. And it's a novel about 2 women who share a life journey and their relationship to the earth, the healing powers of the earth. And yes, I'm excited to share that. Thank you, Joan. Okay, thank you everybody for joining us this evening and later on. As I said, we'll put all the books in the notes, and let us know what books have inspired you, because obviously we're all nuts about books, and we'd love to hear your suggestions. So thank you so much. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, friends.